All right, folks. Hello. We are live from the fourth day of the Massachusetts lockdown. Let's see. We have a bunch of people in the chat already because folks have nothing else to do. So I see that Q is in. Q has been here for a while. Rose Blight is in the house. Mark Mondragon, Jesse Meek, of course, John Sparks. Iron Daisies is here. Gary Hendricks, Tim Allen. Oh, we got the whole crew tonight. Stumble Liner. I don't know how to say that. Amanda Jean, Freebird 0147, Iron Daisies is in. Douglas from Pennsylvania is here today. Stephen Walters. Frank Cohen, Tommy McGee. We've got a whole bunch of people in. John Morgan, Sean Davis is here tonight, was able to make it. Daryl Scott. We got a whole bunch of folks. Meme the Penguin. Jay Kip is in. I do not see Trash Man with his intro, so it looks like we might have to go without him again tonight. My side of the chat is not catching up. Robin Patty is here. The Wolf Pack, Buck Camp, Ross Corbett, GC, Henning Fisher, Raymond Leverens. Yes, I believe. Crip Crack Attack. I don't know what that name means, but that's awesome. Rogue Ranger, Sir Honks a Lot, John Smith, Sinister Italian, Cap and Mac 82, and Shane Lackey. Many, many more are in the house today. Oh, Andy made it. Hello, Andy. I see you in there. Way up there. All right, folks. So a couple of quick announcements before we get going today. Number one, in the midst of this pandemic, I have forgotten and neglected to mention for almost 3 weeks now, unfortunately, that in honor of National Women's History Month, which is apparently this month, which I had never heard of until USCCA let me know, in honor of that, this month, USCCA is honoring women who carry, and they are extending their $25,000 giveaway through March for anyone who signs up through my link to get a membership. They're also, I believe, giving away the cash value of a couple of different pistols, and they've got all kinds of goodies going on over at USCCA to honor the women who carry. So that link is down in the description. And the other thing that we've got going on is currently everything in the state of Massachusetts is closed except for pharmacies and groceries stores. They have not yet issued a shelter in place, but there is rumor that that will be happening by Monday. If that is the case, the live stream setup will have to be moved home to my crappy internet. So I will still be live streaming if that is the case, but I cannot make any attestation to the quality of the video if that happens. So we might have a fun hangout if that happens. And without further ado, I have with me today Mr. Jacob Hornberger, who is one of the Libertarian candidates for president this year, 2020. So you guys have been asking me about the candidates this year and where they stand and their platforms, and you've been asking me all about them, so I decided to bring one to you. To answer some of your questions. So, Jacob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I will say that I watched the campaign pitch speeches over from the California convention and looked through your website, and you have quite the impressive resume.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here, Nikki. It's just an honor and a pleasure, and I'm pleasantly surprised at all the people that are joining you. That's fantastic. So I'm founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is a libertarian educational foundation that I founded 30 years ago. Its mission is to present the pure principled case for liberty. And I should emphasize that they are not endorsing my candidacy. They can't do that. But people can get a sense of the work I've done for liberty by going there and seeing 30 years worth of articles and videos and conferences and so forth. But, I finally have gotten to the point in my life where I said, I want to take these people on, the people who have destroyed our liberty in this country, the Democrats and Republicans both. I want to take them on more directly, and that means in the political arena. So I said, I'm going to jump into this race for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination, and I'm going to present a campaign of principle for the party of principle, where we fight against these Democrats and Republicans with pure libertarian principles. We reject all the Republican-esque positions, the reform-oriented positions, the Republican-like positions, and we go into this battle just fighting with pure libertarian principles. And so far, it's resonated among LP members. It's really exciting and gratifying. We're doing well. We've won caucuses, we've won primaries, we've run straw polls, and so it's an exciting and very gratifying campaign so far.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I really liked. Sorry, folks, the allergies. Speaking of, running as, shedding like Democrat principles, Republican principles, all of that. I think that's really great. And I really liked how you explained it recently. I watched a live stream that you did a few days ago. I think it was called the Revolution podcast or something like that. And you had said, like, hey, when people say, like, okay, well, how would you solve this current crisis? And you say, well, wait. The framework for libertarianism is completely different and outside of what we have already. And I really liked how you described that in that interview. So I don't know if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really an important distinction that you're talking about, because, when people come to me, they say things like, Jacob, what's your position on handling the coronavirus, or education, or the foreign policy. And what they really mean by this is keeping the system intact that Democrats and Republicans have brought into existence, and then making it work with some kind of libertarian solution. Well, that's not what libertarianism is about. We're not about how do we make socialism, interventionism, imperialism, regulation work. You've got an inherently defective paradigm of Democrats and Republicans have forced it upon our land in healthcare, immigration, foreign policy, education, the economy. So what libertarianism is an entirely different philosophy, a different framework, a different paradigm. So what we tell people is, look, we can't help you make your system work. That's impossible. Your system is a bad system. It's inherently defective. What we're proposing to you is an entirely different system, one based on liberty, economic liberty, educational liberty, healthcare liberty, and a limited government republic. And so that's the choice we're giving people. If you look at Democrats and Republicans, I see them as just one party. It's basically welfare warfare party, and it's divided into two wings, sort of like the National Football League. But what we're talking about with libertarianism is an entirely different party, a different system, a different paradigm, different framework, as you put it.
Mm-hmm. So for the folks that are in the chat, because I have a broad swath of viewers, everything from, voluntarist and ANCAPs, libertarians, minarchists, all the way to, Republicans, and sometimes even some Democrats and leftists in there, occasionally when they get a little lost. So for the folks that don't know, like, how would you explain, like, the basics of libertarianism?
Okay, the basic core principle of libertarianism is that you have a right to live your life any way you choose, so long as you're not initiating force or fraud against another person. So as long as you're not murdering, raping, stealing, defrauding people, you have a right to live your life and make your choices any way you want. Now, the average person might say, well, gosh, Jacob, that sounds pretty good. I can go along with that. But the rub comes in on the application. So, for example, you have the basic, fundamental, natural, God-given right to keep everything you earn and decide for yourself what to do with it. And so libertarians naturally believe in a system of 100% voluntary charity. That means that when people come and ask you for assistance, you have a right to say yes or no. Like when you're in the grocery store line, the cashier says, you want to donate $1 to such and such? You can say yes or no. That's the essence of freedom. Well, that's not the kind of case that we have today. It's not the kind of life. We live under a system of what's called mandatory charity. And the crown jewel of this is Social Security. The seniors have convinced themselves that they've contributed into a fund, that they've donated all their lives. This is just nonsense. It's self-deception.
No.
It's just mandatory charity. They're taking money from people of your age group and everybody under, let's say, 55 or so, and they're transferring it to seniors. And this is mandatory charity. And it's really an insult to young people. Where do I stand on Social Security? Abolish it immediately. Now, you have some people saying, including opponents for this race in the Libertarian Party, saying, "Oh, that's not showing caring or compassion." Well, what are they talking about? The caring and compassion of the Internal Revenue Service and the initiation of force against young people. Where's the caring and compassion there? So I say, eliminate it, because you can count on freedom. I mean, for one thing, that is freedom, being free to decide for yourself whether it helps somebody else or not. But I know that freedom works. Children and grandchildren would step up to the plate. Now they're keeping all their money, no more withholding, no more FICA taxes at all. It all comes to them. And they step up to the plate and help parents and grandparents that are in need. There's church groups that come to the fore. There's neighborhood groups. There's charitable foundations. There's wealthier people that donate to worthy causes. That's what we're talking about, a free society and a meaningful society, because now all choices are voluntary and all charity is voluntary. So that's just one example of how different libertarians see the world and see the concept of liberty as compared to Democrats and Republicans.
Right. And I think that Social Security is an excellent example on two fronts. Number one, like you said, how a lot of people think that it's like, oh, well, I'm taking this money from my check and putting it in a bank account for myself for later on. And that's not how it works at all. And that's how my parents had explained it to me when I was younger. And then I grew up and did some research. It's like, no, I'm not getting that money back later. That's long gone to someone else. There's no account with my name on it, number one. And number two, as far as the having voluntary charity as opposed to state enforced. I mean, I have worked in the state with the Department of Mental Health, and I have worked in the private sector at nonprofits, and the nonprofits were far more efficient at helping people. And, I think that a lot of times one of the arguments that we get as libertarians is, well, people are inherently bad and greedy, and they would never contribute. They would never help people out. But I mean, granted, right now we are in the midst of a global pandemic, but I'm seeing everywhere people donating their extra food. I mean, Disney donating their food to the local communities, people stepping up and 3D printing supplies, people crowdfunding new ICU bays in their local hospitals and all this stuff. I think that if given the opportunity and not through force, people absolutely would step up and help other people in their community.
Oh, there's no question about it. And you see what they've done, these statists have done, and a statist is a person that looks to the government to solve all societal woes, is that they've convinced people of your age group, or I would say people, let's say, less than 50 years old. They've convinced them that they are bad people. They're essentially saying, you are a bad person. You cannot be trusted with freedom. And so we just have to force you to do this, and we're going to just take your money by force and give it to seniors, because we know that you would not help your parents out if it came to that, or your grandparents. And unfortunately, a lot of younger people have inculcated that as part of their mindset. It's sort of a self-esteem problem, that if you can get younger people to say, wait a minute now, I'm not that bad a person. I want to be trusted with freedom. I want to have this opportunity to make these choices on my own. Once that happens and people get that positive sense of self-esteem, where they're not only believing in themselves, but they're believing in others, and they're believing in freedom, then all of a sudden everything changes, because now the support for this coercive system that's really a big racket. I mean, think how many bureaucrats in Social Security there are, and Medicare and Medicaid and education, and then the IRS agents. These are huge salaries, sometimes $100,000 salaries that would not have to be wasted in a private charitable system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that you bring up a good point of how a lot of people in my generation, or as you say, like pretty much anyone under the age of 55, has sort of been, we'll say, indoctrinated to, the mechanisms of the state and all of that. And I think I've always said that my primary goal with my channel and my videos and everything that I write has been to educate people that, like, there is an alternative way, and we don't need to have this giant nanny state government, that these things can be achieved privately in a free market system. And I think that that's probably the biggest key, is just educating and passing out this information.
I think your word indoctrination is perfect, and that's really where the public school system, the state school system.
Oh God, yes.
I mean, that's what they do. That's the purpose of state schooling, is to indoctrinate people. So you end up not only destroying the natural love of learning that characterizes every kid when he's 0 to 6, but you also indoctrinate them with the notion that all of this control is freedom. Mm-hmm. So the German thinker Johann Goethe really came up with the greatest quote that really embodies what's happened to the American people. He says, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." Mm. And because if you're a slave but you believe you're free, you have no incentive to break your chains. You're over there expressing gratitude for how free you are. And that's exactly what we see today. We see Americans thanking the troops for protecting their freedom. And in their mind, they really think they're free. And this is one of the distinguishing characteristics of libertarians. We have broken through the indoctrination. We understand that this system is not freedom. And so our lives are entirely different. We see the world in totally different from other people. And when they come up to us and they say, well, what is libertarianism all about? We say, well, we're trying to achieve a free society. They look at us like we're crazy. Like, well, what do you mean? We are already free. And well, they don't have that grip on reality. And that's what distinguishes us as libertarians. We have a grip on reality that non-libertarians just don't have.
Mm-hmm. We recognize that there would still be roads.
And there'd still be education and healthcare, and yeah.
So I saw some people had put out some super chats with some questions, so I want to get to those. First, I want to thank J.K. Sully. Thank you for your little jumpy pear #1 fan. Chester Thomas says, be sure and keep an eye on the anti-gun bills the left is trying to sneak through while we are distracted by COVID-19. Probably going to do a video on that at some point. Jesse Meek says, welcome, Mr. Hornberger. Thank you for all you do. Please never give in to tyranny and keep up the great work.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you. You don't have to worry about me giving in to tyranny. I'll guarantee you
that. Mark P., thank you. He is blowing us a kiss, apparently. Trashman4444, who usually does my intro, says, started trying to get on at 6:45. Anyone else having internet trouble tonight? I saw a few other people in there in the chat saying that they had some issues. I believe it's probably an issue with the servers, because there's probably a lot more people on YouTube because they have nothing else to do. Okay, Robin Patty says, legally, not morally speaking, what are your views on price gouging, free market capitalism, or legally wrong?
Oh, free market capitalism, of course. The price gouger actually provides a great benefit for mankind. People don't realize that. There's a great article that was published, 15, 20 years ago, that I'm sure people can find online. It was published in the Wall Street Journal. It's called The Speculator as Hero by a libertarian from New York named Victor Niederhofer. But what the speculator is doing, and that's what the so-called price gouger, is a horrible name for somebody that's really a benefactor to society. What he does is he takes the risks of buying low and hopefully selling high. And in the process, he's conserving what can be very scarce resources. Now, for example, there's a guy that just got caught, he stocked up on gigantic amounts of toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and they're all condemning him and vilifying him. Well, if there had been no pandemic, this guy might have had to sell his toilet paper and hand sanitizers at a loss. I mean, that's the nature of speculation. But let's say he hits this time. Well, then the price zooms up. He's going to try to make a maximum profit on this. Well, that price sends a signal, and that's the benefits of a price system in a free market. It sends a signal immediately to consumers. You need to conserve. So you don't want to waste your toilet paper on blowing your nose or whatever. You don't want to waste your water. Time to conserve because it's so ultra expensive. At the same time, you send a message to suppliers saying, hey, if you want to make a quick profit here, rush into this marketplace. And so they produce real fast to take advantage of the profit opportunity, hand sanitizers, toilet paper, and so forth. Same thing in the hurricanes. You see this phenomenon where they're going after the price gougers. Let's say they're selling bottled water for $10 a bottle. Well, all they're doing is saying there's only a set number of bottles of water here, conserve, but they're also telling people, if you want to take a risk to bring bottled water into this area where, it's dangerous, the hurricane, the aftermath, and so forth, take your chances here. And then as the supply increases, the price starts to come down and it stabilizes. But if you get rid of the price gouger, then there's no signals here. People buy their toilet paper, use it as whatever, waste it, whatever, and then find out, now what do we do because there's nothing left. So the price gouger is actually a great hero.
Well, I mean, he certainly stops the shelves from going empty in an instant with basic supply and demand. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point is, let's say you've got 100 bottles of water in this area. Well, nothing's going to change that. So the question is, how do you allocate it? If you don't allow the price to zoom up, the first person in there can buy 50 bottles and the second person buys another 50 and they use it for whatever they want. But everybody else is left out in the cold. With the price zooming up, now there's a more equitable allocation of those 100 bottles. And at the same time, the signal is sent to suppliers, we need bottled water, get it in here, and you can make a good profit. So the price system is a fantastic system for allocating scarce resources.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I saw another question in here somewhere back, kind of a typical election type question. How would you try to get a handle on the $23 trillion national debt? And that is from Stephen Lundgren.
Well, actually, a libertarian president would have some means by which to deal with that. Number one, I favor bringing all the troops home from everywhere immediately. I mean, this is where President Trump has turned out to be no different from Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Hillary Clinton. We still have troops in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, or at least bombing Yemen, and they're all over the world. I would bring them home not just from the so-called forever wars. I'd bring them home from everywhere. Korea, Europe, World War II's over, Africa, Latin America. And then I'd take it a step further. As soon as they get here on American shores, discharge them. They're not necessary. We want to end this whole foreign policy of foreign interventionism. It is an extremely horrendous foreign policy. Notice that nobody's invading the United States. And so if you bring all these interventionist troops and CIA agents home and discharge them, well, now all of a sudden you don't need the war on terrorism anymore because you don't have anti-American terrorism. You can get rid of Homeland Security, TSA, and so forth. And then you start working on the empire of domestic military bases, which as a president, as a commander in chief, you have a right to start laying off workers, soldiers. So we're talking about a large amount of money there. lift all sanctions and embargoes immediately that have been set by executive decree. In pardon all drug offenders, or actually pardon all non-violent offenders in the federal system, which empties out a large portion of the penitentiaries. That saves a lot of money. And then here's the kicker, though. You see, they've got this price ceiling, and I'm sorry, the debt ceiling that says that when you reach this amount of debt, you cannot borrow any more money. Now, we know that every time they reach that debt ceiling, they cut a deal that extends the debt ceiling for another 3 years. And, President Trump went through all this charade of shutting down the government, but we all knew he was going to cave. Republicans always cave when it comes to liberty. And so he caved, and they give all the back pay to the people that were out of jobs during the closure. A libertarian president, or at least I would, simply say, we're going to enforce this debt ceiling, come hell or high water. So when they say, well, Jacob, but the government's going to have to close, the federal government, I'd say, yeah, that's going to happen. And you keep it that way. And so all of a sudden, you see, now we're talking, and we're not talking about just closing the so-called non-essential. Their definition of non-essential is not the same as my definition of non-essential. And now you're talking about saving a tremendous amount of money with a federal closure of the so-called non-essential, and sticking by your guns. That all the crazy, the sky is falling stories wouldn't affect me one iota.
So, to extend on that, there are people that are in the comments and saying, well, what about if you brought troops home and let them finish out their enlistment instead of just automatically discharging them? Because there's a lot of people in the comments that don't seem to like that idea.
Well, yeah, because they don't see the burden that this sector of society is putting on the American people. That, we talked earlier about the mandatory charity people, the recipients of the dole, and it goes beyond Social Security. We can talk about Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, education grants. That if we're going to have a free society, we have to dismantle the infringements on liberty. First, we have to identify what are the infringements on liberty, and then we got to dismantle them. That if we don't dismantle them, then we're not really free. If all we succeed as libertarians in doing is reforming this welfare warfare state way of life, we haven't achieved freedom any more than slavery reform, fewer lashings and so forth would have meant freedom for slaves. To achieve freedom, you've got to dismantle the structure of slavery and the structure of welfare warfare state serfdom. So here it looks like, oh, well, this is a cruel thing to discharge all these workers. Actually, it's a wonderful thing. Why is this? Well, if you let them live out their enlistment, you're talking about a lot more tax money that is going in to fund these people. Remember, public sector people live off taxes that are taken out of the private sector. That's disadvantageous for Americans, because the more money that is retained in the private sector, the more capital comes into existence. People start saving money. Right now, nobody saves anything because the government's taking so much money. Well, all of a sudden, suppose you start saving a little nest egg every month, especially, millennials and people in their 30s and 40s. Then that money's put into banks. It's loaned out to businesses. They purchase capital, equipment. That makes workers more productive. This is the key to higher standards of living. Well, if all of a sudden you're taking an entire sector of the public sector and putting it in the private sector, now the private sector doesn't have to fund this anymore. Now they can retain all that money. Oh, but notice now what the soldiers are doing. They're no longer in a non-productive sector. They're now in the private sector. So they're now contributing to the production of wealth. So it's a doubly positive effect. As you reduce the size of the public sector, you are benefiting the entire society through savings and accumulation of capital in higher standards of living.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So hopefully that cleared it up for a few people. Another question that just came in, I think this is actually a really good one. Dragon's Talon 1001 says, Mr. Hornberger, would you do away with the IRS and go back to strictly import excise taxes, such as goods coming into and out of the country, to fund the federal government?
Yes and no.
Dun, dun, dun.
Getting rid of the IRS is a no-brainer. And people sometimes have told me over the years, oh, Jacob, you're too impractical, you're too utopian. And how can anything really be considered impractical or utopian when it's been done before? Utopia means impossible to achieve. Well, there once existed a society that lived for more than 100 years without income taxation and the IRS, where people were free to keep everything they earned. Imagine, for more than a century, people were free to keep everything they earned and decide for themselves what to do. And I'm of course, talking about the United States. That was one of our good founding principles. There were some bad ones, no doubt about it, slavery and women's rights and so forth. But there were good ones, and that was one of the good ones. So people can't say it's impractical or utopian because we've already proven that it's achievable. Now, there's no tax that I like. Taxation necessarily involves the initiation of force. If I have to choose between taxes, darn sure I'm going to choose the excise tax or maybe a tariff, which is a sales tax on imported goods. But my belief is that one of these days, the freest society in history is going to be the one where you have a limited government republic, where its powers are extremely few and limited, and which is voluntarily funded by the citizenry. That most people believe in government at a local level. People believe that it's important to have a police force to go after murderers and rapists and thieves and so on. They favor a federal government that has a federal judiciary and that has a basic military force that can garner up support in case the United States is ever invaded by some foreign nation state, which is a non-existent possibility. We're talking about very low expenditures of government at that point. Would an indirect taxes, which our framers called it, be better than a direct tax like an income tax? Absolutely. But my belief is that to achieve a real free society, you have that government in place, but it's entirely voluntarily funded through donations or whatever other devices they can come up with for voluntary support.
Okay. All right. We got another question in. Let me go back and find it. So this isn't so much a question as a statement. Trashman says, we were isolationist in the 30s. Japan ended that. China is building up like Japan did in the 20s and 30s.
Well, it's interesting that word isolationist. Not really sure. It has different meanings. That right now, I believe we live in a very isolationist society. Now, why do I say that? Well, because we live under a system where the government, the federal government, its power is unleashed around the world. It can invade whatever country it wants, and it does. Coups, occupations, bombings, alliances with foreign dictators. They just stomp anywhere they want to go. At the same time, the private sector is very isolated from the rest of the world. We have trade restrictions, travel restrictions, and I'm talking about even independent of the coronavirus. We have trade wars that are started by the president. We have immigration controls. We have a police state along the southern border of the United States, consisting of checkpoints and roving border patrol checkpoints and trespasses on the farms and ranches. So, and then you've got embargoes and sanctions that isolate Americans, keep them from traveling to places like Cuba, Iran, North Korea. So you've got an isolated private sector and an unleashed federal government. What I favor is the exact opposite. Bring home the federal government and stop it from bombing and assassinating people and so forth overseas, but unleash the private sector. Have total unilateral free trade and all the managed trade agreements and all the sanctions, all the embargoes, all the trade wars, and the immigration controls. So now you have the American private sector that's interacting freely with people all over the world. That's the opposite of isolationism. My experience from traveling around the world is that people love Americans. They love our tourism. They love our business groups. They love our culture groups. They love our money. They just don't like the federal government. And I think with justification, because the federal government unleashed just goes around and killing people, wreaking havoc, and so forth. Now, when he talks about the 1930s, actually, the isolationism that he calls there was a mindset among the American people that they didn't want to get involved in another foreign war. That we had seen what had happened. They had seen what had happened in World War I, which was a total waste of American life. I mean, World War I was a devastating event for the United States. You don't hear much about it anymore because people that supported that war and interventionists in general, they don't want people to think about World War I. But it was supposed to end all future wars. It was going to make the world safe for democracy. It's the exact opposite. It was actually at the Treaty of Versailles, which the United States brought about because of its total defeat of Germany. That's what gave rise to Hitler and the Nazi Party. So what he calls isolationism was really non-interventionism. The overwhelming number of Americans, I'd say like 80, 90% said never again. And it was Franklin Roosevelt, the president, who went in there and was dead set on getting America involved in World War II. And but he knew he couldn't get a declaration of war from Congress. So after trying to provoke the Germans, they wouldn't take the bait. He goes into the Pacific. He freezes all Japanese bank accounts. He enters into humiliating demands on the Japanese as part of a negotiated agreement. He knew they would never agree with that. But most important, he put an oil embargo on Japan that was pretty much worldwide. Well, Japan had no choice. I mean, they needed the oil for their war machine in China. So the only reason they attacked Pearl Harbor was not to invade the United States and conquer the United States. It was only to knock out the Pacific Fleet because they were going to invade the Dutch East Indies to get their oil. And of course, that's what gave Roosevelt his excuse, and that's what got us into World War II. So I think what he calls isolationism is a little bit different from what I call isolationism.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I think that is a big distinction: isolationist versus like non-interventionist. Anyway, it reminds me back to the Ron Paul days, talking about how we should not be the policemen of the world. Essentially,
that's exactly it. And there's that famous episode where Ron was in that debate in the 2008 primary election when he said they were talking about 9/11, and he said, well, they came over here to kill us because the government was over there killing them. Mm-hmm. And boy, everybody went ballistic. And I remember watching that debate thinking, Ron, you heroic son of a gun, but you're dead in the water now. And that's actually when his campaign took off, because everybody recognized he was telling the truth. He was genuine. And in fact, that's what foreign interventionism does. It produces the anger and the rage that generates the terrorist retaliation. And then that's what manifests itself in, after 9/11, the war on terrorism, Homeland Security, TSA. I mean, they used their own event that their interventionism has produced as the excuse for destroying our liberty here at home with surveillance, assassinations. I mean, did you ever think when you were a kid that you would live under a government that has the power to assassinate its own citizens? And yet that's what we're living under: mass secret surveillance and assassination.
Absolutely. So let's see. We have one from Nobody. He says they brought in the infected for big pharma. Would you? So I think that's a suggestion that coronavirus was created to help big pharma or something. As far as I know, I believe what happened is just China didn't do anything about it for a month and disappeared the doctors and nurses and researchers that were saying that corona was an issue, and then let everyone travel around the world is, I believe, what happened. At least that's what they're saying now in the most recent articles. So there's lots of questions about Second Amendment stuff, because that's a big thing on this channel. So someone said that they want to hear your opinion on machine guns.
Well, my conviction is that people have a right to own whatever weapon they want. Any gun, machine gun, AR, 15. Whatever. M16. I mean, for one thing, we're talking about private property, and the foundation of a private property order is of a free society is a private property order. I think I said AR-15. I think I meant AR-14. I'm getting them at AR-14. People have a right to own anything under principles of private property. Okay. Secondly, this is the key to a free society. I would have put the Second Amendment first, because without the First Amendment, without the Second Amendment, the First Amendment's worthless. They're not going to. The politicians, we can see already happening in this coronavirus, they're not going to pay attention to an amendment in the Constitution. And as long as if people are disarmed, as long as people are armed, they're more cautious about what they do, suppressing freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so forth. Then the other thing is protect self-defense. That when they enact gun control measures, they're denying people the right to defend themselves against murderers, rapists, thieves, and so forth. And those people are not going to give a hoot about gun control laws. If they're not going to give a hoot about murder laws, why are they going to rape laws? Why are they going to give a hoot about a gun law? So all you're doing with this stuff is disarming peaceful, law-abiding people. Now, what about the violence in American society that is used to justify this? Well, look at Switzerland. Switzerland is well armed as we are. I mean, everybody has an assault rifle in his house, and everything's oriented toward defense. You don't see the Swiss government in Iraq, Afghanistan, foreign aid, and all this interventionist stuff. Well, you don't see acts of mass violence, and you don't see Switzerland as a violent society. So it's not guns that cause the violence. One is the drug war. That's a root cause of much of the violence, if not most of the violence in American society, and certainly Mexican society. Legalize all drugs. They belong in the private sector. Heroin, cocaine, meth. They belong in private rehab groups, therapy, counseling. They don't belong in the criminal justice field. So you get rid of all the cartels and all the drug lords overnight. They can't compete in a legitimate market. So you get rid of all that violence. And including the addicts who are trying to get the money to pay for the huge black market prices. I mean, you don't see winos robbing people to get the money to buy a bottle of wine. And then once you end all this foreign interventionism, I think all that killing spree. I mean, it's impossible to know how many people the U.S. government has killed in the last 30 years, especially in the Middle East and Afghanistan, but certainly in the hundreds of thousands. And the attitude's always been that won't affect American society. Well, I think it does. I think it seeps into the subconsciousness of people over here. So you've got off-kilter people who ordinarily would just be a little off-kilter, a little weird in the community. We've all seen people like that. But I think what's happening, it's triggering all this foreign killing spree is triggering something in these people where they just go out and say, well, if the United States doesn't have any value on foreign life, why should I have any value on human life here at home? And so they go out and start shooting up a bunch of people they don't even know. Well, that's exactly what the U.S. government's doing overseas. So I call it a copycat killing. That I think that's what's going on. So you bring the interventionists home, no more foreign interventionism, you legalize drugs, then you deprive the gun grabbers of their principal excuse, violence, for grabbing our guns.
Right. I mean, and certainly if things are legal, you can't really have a black market where a need for one doesn't even exist.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you like the violence in the drug war, make ownership of guns illegal. I mean, you haven't seen anything like that violence until you do that.
So nobody commented again and says that they brought in infected guys to boost profits long-term, push Medicare for all, raise prices temporarily, and cause scarcity and gain power. Would he do it too? So I'm not really sure. Is that a question about like Medicare for all and raising prices? So I guess we'll go with the Medicare for all thing. So I mean, I suppose what would you say is your position on healthcare?
I think that what they're getting at is that there's been the invention, creation of these viruses and dangerous things like anthrax and stuff at Fort Detrick for decades. I mean, this has been part of the U.S. government's operations to come up with these horrible viruses and sicknesses and germ warfare and so forth. I think what they might be getting at is there's a conspiracy theory going around the internet that this is the army that produced this and introduced it in China to bring China down as part of, the antipathy that Trump and the Republicans and the whole Washington establishment has against China becoming wealthy and prosperous and so forth. I mean, that's what Trump's trade war is about, is to try to impoverish China and his sanctions and so forth. Well, to me, it's sort of irrelevant. Nobody's ever going to prove such a thing. So there's no point even going down that road. I mean, we have to assume that this is what they say it is, a virus that came about from animals and jumped into humans and so forth. All right, so let's talk about healthcare. Well, before coronavirus comes along, for 30 years, Nikki, I've been arguing at the Future of Freedom Foundation. I said, you've got this ongoing, never-ending healthcare crisis. Everybody acknowledges that. And we shouldn't forget that in the midst of this super crisis that healthcare has always been in crisis. Well, you've got a system that is inherently defective. That's why it's been in crisis. And so what do they do to deal with this crisis? Well, they double down. They say, well, we're going to need, on top of Medicare and Medicaid, Obamacare. And this will fix it. Okay, well, I knew it wasn't going to fix it, and I said it wasn't going to fix it. And so sure enough, they enact Obamacare, and the crisis gets bigger. So then they say, well, we need Medicare for all. You see, they're doubling down in the wrong direction. Well, if you go back to when I was a kid, in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, we had the finest healthcare system in history. I mean, it boggles the mind how great our healthcare system was. Healthcare, this was before Medicare and Medicaid. Healthcare costs were low. They were stable. There wasn't even an issue of pre-existing conditions because nobody had insurance.
Right.
Nobody needed insurance because healthcare costs were so low and stable. Going to the doctors was like going to the hospital. I mean, to the grocery store. How many people have grocery store insurance to protect against the soaring costs of groceries? Nobody. And that's the way healthcare was. You go to the doctors, like taking your car to the car dealer, you just pay, and that was it, because it was so low and stable. In terms of voluntary charity, I grew up in the poorest city in the United States, Laredo, Texas, right on the border, U.S.-Mexico border. Doctors' offices were filled every day. And the doctors knew that most of them couldn't pay. They never turned away anybody. And still, doctors were making a lot of money. They were the second wealthiest people in town, second only to the oil people. And because taxes were so low. So you had voluntary charity that because doctors felt like this was the ethical thing to do. And it was all done without coercion. And there was a vibrancy in the health inventions, innovations, all dynamism in the healthcare industry. Doctors love what they did in life. They would make house calls. We would sometimes go to the doctor, who was a friend of ours, at his house over a weekend to get a tetanus shot. It was so totally different. Okay, so then Medicare and Medicaid come into existence, and that was the end. Because you put this huge artificial government demand, much of which is based on fraud, on this system that ends up destroying this finest healthcare system in history. That's when prices started soaring. Well, there's only one solution to this, and I've said this for 30 years. You've got to get rid of Medicare and Medicaid immediately. It's like a tumor on the body politic. And for 30 years, people have been saying, Jacob, you're too radical, you're too extreme. Show us some reform that'll work. And I keep telling them, no reform is going to work. Health savings accounts, whatever reform you come up with, it's not going to work. You've got to get rid of Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare. You've got to separate healthcare in the state entirely. Get rid of occupational licensure. Milton Friedman talked about that in the medical profession. And get rid of all the government control, the management of healthcare. All right. So I've been saying that for 30, and I'll say it again. It's the only solution. No other solutions. Okay. So now we get coronavirus, and I'm just fascinated by this because you've now got this dysfunctional healthcare system that I've been advocating to get rid of for 30 years that is now trying to deal with the greatest, biggest healthcare threat in our lifetime. And it's fascinating. Watch them. I mean, they've got a shortage of testing kits. Everybody's running around like a chicken with his head cut off. New York Times had an article this morning on the front page of what the Centers for Disease Control is doing and all the controls they're doing. It's chaos. It's what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. You couldn't find a better term to describe what's going on here. And how do they respond to this? They get angry, they get upset, and they start turning to tyranny and oppression, where governors are acting like dictators and Trump's acting like his normal dictatorial self. And they're also all in this together, the Democrats and Republicans. Well, this is a direct result of not having listened to me. Now, what would have happened 20 years ago if who said, Jacob, you're right. Let's separate healthcare in the state. Let's get rid of the income tax, the IRS, FICA tax, mandatory charity. Okay, the average family would have paid, what, $20,000 in taxes over the last 20 years. That's $400,000 plus interest in a family's bank account. That's a nice little nest egg to cover you during this period when you're going to be unemployed. You'd have a dynamic healthcare system where there'd be plenty of kits. You had entrepreneurs rushing into the market. We'd be looking to healthcare professionals to guide us out of this crisis instead of politicians and bureaucrats. All right, so that's water under the bridge. But what do we do today? And that's why I've entered this race for the LP presidential nomination. What we need to do today is separate healthcare in the state, get rid of Medicare and Medicaid immediately, get rid of the income tax, have a free society where you have this dynamism in healthcare, in the economy, in money, separate money in the state, in education, separate education in the state. So you can see that we libertarians cannot tell these people how to solve this crisis, okay? Because that's not what libertarianism is. We don't have a philosophy that's telling socialists and statists and interventionists how to run their system. That's not what we're about. We're about an entirely new system, a new framework. So if people like the direction and where we are in America, vote for Trump, vote for Biden. Doesn't make any difference. It's just musical chairs between the two of them. There's not any difference between the two of them philosophically. If you want a different system, come and join my campaign, a system based on health and freedom and prosperity and harmony and morality. Now we're talking about a different framework rather than musical chairs trying to run a corrupt, dysfunctional system.
Mm-hmm. I want to get to a few other questions, but I mean, certainly when you talk about, dismantling how, Medicare, Medicaid, and the insurance companies, all that have made the healthcare system worse. I mean, I can attest to the fact, like, as a mental health care provider, there are people that come to me and, they don't have insurance or they don't want to use insurance. And I always say to them, like, hey, okay, well, if you're going to pay cash discount, because, I don't have to worry about as much paperwork with them, as much billing, as much administrative burden. I don't even necessarily, I don't legally have to give them a diagnosis or anything like that. It's just treatment, and that's it, without all the extra stuff that comes on top of it that's required typically by insurance companies. And so there does become a lot more freedom. I can see someone for longer than 45 minutes or see them more than once a week, or whatever it is that they want or need, without the constraints of someone else telling me what I need to do. And I think you're right. Even now, the CDC and the government, I mean, they didn't have enough tests. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. And it is, people getting together with their 3D printers to make ventilators and masks and things like that. I mean, and it is entirely possible that this crisis would be very different if we did not have managed care on top of it. I think
there's no
that's
question.
A really good point.
I mean, go to the New York Times today and just read the article about how the government is managing this. And it's not a question of Donald Trump being a poor central planner. I mean, he clearly is, but it's a question of, should there be central planning, or should there be a free market in healthcare? And what you described is perfectly the way things would be, that you would, if you get rid of Medicare and Medicaid, in addition to what you described, where you have this freedom as a healthcare provider to deal with people, prices would plummet immediately. And now there's a lot more access to this because people can afford it. And now it's allocated under market conditions. And then if you get rid of occupational licensure, you've got this flood of healthcare providers coming into the market. So the free market is the best of everything. This is what I keep telling people. This is our heritage, socialism. Look at Italy. High death toll in Italy. Is it a coincidence that they have a socialist government-managed healthcare system and a bankrupt government that is overwhelming in debt? I don't think it's a coincidence at all that when you have that kind of system, it's going to be worse than if you have a dynamic free. If we had a free market healthcare system, I have no doubts that this thing would be managed very quickly and very efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Jesse Meeks says, never let an emergency go to waste. Many in the government are using this as a trial run on how much we will tolerate, i.e. socialism, communism. And I say personally, that is probably the biggest thing that I'm worried about with all of this is not like the virus itself, but the overreach, the government overreach that's coming out to try to control this thing. And I mean, I don't think, like, in California, they're saying that these measures are now in place indefinitely. I think it will be difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of some of these measures that they're implementing now to fight this virus.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, look what happened in the 1930s. You have the Federal Reserve that causes the stock market to crash in 1929. And this was an alien form of governmental structure, the Federal Reserve. It came into existence in 1913. And then they used that emergency, that was an economic emergency, not a healthcare emergency, to totally transform American life into a welfare warfare state. It was a revolutionary transformation. A lot of people don't realize how significant that transformation was. And then ultimately a warfare state or a national security state, which is a totalitarian form of governmental structure as compared to a limited government republic with a basic military force. I mean, emergencies are the time-honored way in history that people lose their liberty. And that's why the framers did not put an emergency exception into the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. It says you cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It doesn't say unless it's an emergency, because they understood that emergencies are when people are more eager, they're more willing, they're afraid. Yes, take away my liberty, just keep me safe, keep me secure. And as you point out, what ends up happening is it's like the chickens that go to the fox and say, Mr. Fox, we're in trouble, take care of us, put us in our pen and guard us. Well, it's temporarily, of course. If we know the outcome of that story.
Right. I mean, I think that we're going to end up having, that instead of like BCE or, before a common era, it's going to be like BCV before coronavirus. I think we'll have to change the way we talk.
Events. It really is one of the, we see it with like the JFK assassination. That's a big event, transformative event. We see it with 9/11. That was a transformative event. And now we see it with the coronavirus. This is going to be one of those transformative events. And hopefully good can come out of this, because also out of crisis comes opportunity. And so that's where we libertarians come into play, is that we let our fellow Americans know that there's a reason for why this is happening. There's a cause of it, not in terms of the virus itself, but how it's being managed. That if you like the way it's being managed, vote for Trump, vote for Biden, keep supporting these people, and you'll get more of the same. You want a different framework, join up with the libertarians, and specifically join up with me.
John Stiles asks, what are your thoughts on our currency? Should we go back to one of gold and silver? Do you advocate ending the Federal Reserve?
Great question. We had also the finest monetary system in history. It was a gold coin, silver coin standard. The coins were minted by the U.S. Treasury, and they were solid coins. There was never any clipping of the coins, which would happen in the old days, where kings would try to get extra money by shaving off the coins and melting down the shavings. None of that. These were stout coins, American Eagle, silver dollars, $20 St. Gaudens piece. This was our system, and the Constitution set this up. They gave the power to the federal government to coin money, not print money. There's a provision that says no state shall make anything but gold and silver coins legal tender. so that system lasts 125 years or so, a little bit more than 125 years. And it was one of the major contributing factors to the tremendous rise in the standard of living of the American people in the late 1800s, early 1900s, along with no income taxation and open border, open immigration, and so forth. So all of a sudden, the 30s come along and the stock market crashed. The Federal Reserve comes into existence in 1913. They end up destroying the system. Roosevelt, in a classic dictatorial decree, nationalizes gold. I mean, it's incredible what this man did. What he did was no different from what communist countries were doing. This was the official money of the American people. He says, turn it in. And he orders them to turn it in, like these orders that governors and Trump are issuing now. And if they didn't turn it in, they got caught, they would be prosecuted for a federal felony. And so everybody's got to turn in their gold coins. For some reason, they didn't nationalize silver too. But over time, they printed. Paper money was now made the official money of the country. And of course, that was what they used to fund the ever-growing welfare warfare state. They just kept printing money. They drove silver out of circulation because you oversupply the market with paper money. It's going to drive out the good money. Bad money drives out good money. And so you end up with this crooked, corrupt system that they gave us the recessions, the depressions, these bubbles bursting and then inflating the bubble. It's a totally unstable system. So yes, get rid of the Federal Reserve immediately. It's a socialist institution. It's based on the socialist principle of monetary central planning. But I would not go back to the gold coin, silver coin standard, which I consider the second best monetary system. The best monetary system is, again, the free market. The free market produces the best of everything. And Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel Prize-winning libertarian economist, brought this up in an essay called The Denationalization of Money. Just separate money in the state, like I talked about separating healthcare in the state, separating the economy in the state, separating education in the state, separate money in the state. Let the free market decide what money is going to be used. If people in the market settle on gold coins, silver coins, bitcoins, American Express banknotes, or a combination of all that, so be it. That's what the free market does. It produces the best of whatever you're dealing with. And in this case, it will produce the best money.
Well, that actually answered the next question that I was going to ask too, because I mean, it asked about what currencies do you think would be the future? I mean, and that pretty much answers it. But I mean, I think it's Murray Rothbard it might be The War Against the Fed. One of his books about the Fed talks about how really money and currency is just whatever the current society puts value in, really. I mean, that's all that a currency is an agreed upon thing that has value amongst the people. So, I mean, it could be anything, like you said. I mean, whatever the free market comes up with. Yeah, because there's been instances where, like, cigarettes are money. Like in jails and stuff, oftentimes cigarettes serve as the medium of exchange. So, and you're right, it's all subjective. I mean, that's what Rothbard and Mises and the Austrian school are famous for, is that value is subjective. It lies in the eyes of the beholder. And so that subjectivity would determine overall in the marketplace what's going to be used as money, whether it's cigarettes or gold coins, silver coins, bitcoins, whatever. What you can be rest assured is that the market's going to produce the best money. There's some people in the chat saying that toilet paper is the new currency. Right, absolutely. I offered my next door neighbor today 5 rolls of paper towels for 1 roll of toilet paper. FTBFPV asks, can you ask Jacob what his plans would be for implementing such drastic changes, or what can be done on day one? Well, the last thing we want is a libertarian dictator. And so the president, from a libertarian perspective, can do certain things. He can bring all the troops home. He can start discharging soldiers. He can lift sanctions and embargoes that have been set by executive decree. He can pardon all nonviolent offenders. So there's certain things that he can do, but let's face it, he would be faced with a Democratic Republican Congress. So obviously, when
a Libertarian president introduces a bill to repeal Social Security. That's going to go nowhere. But I think what's important, though, in a campaign, like in this Libertarian Party campaign for the nomination and then after the nomination, is that we make the case for what a free society is. Even though as a practical matter, we know that it might not happen immediately. But if people start understanding what freedom is about, they start talking about it, they start discussing and debating it, and then that's when we got a shot. Because look how the libertarian movement has grown over the last several years. I mean, last 20 years, it's incredible. And so this gives us hope that, hey, people can break through. They can see the virtues of liberty. And so I think that's what I want to do, or would want to do if I'm accorded the honor of this nomination, is go out on the campaign trail and say, this is what we need to do to achieve a free society. If I had my druthers, I'd have every family across America discussing and debating two questions in this general election. One, what does it really mean to be free? What does that term really mean? Because a lot of people think they're free, but they're not. And secondly, what is the legitimate role of government in a free society? And I figure if people are thinking at that higher level, we got our shot at making some real open field running for a free society.
Mm-hmm. So in that vein, I mean, I haven't watched his current campaign stuff, but I know that back in the day, at least, Adam Kokesh was advocating something similar. So what would you say differentiates you from him on the campaign trail and in that regard?
Well, Adam's a good friend, and we get along, and we're kind of buddies, and it's been kind of a pleasure to campaign with him at all these state conventions, because we get along really well, and he has said some very nice things about me, and I say very nice things about him. But we have a fundamental disagreement on how to approach these things, and I think that his system, and I'm not saying anything new. He knows this. I've pointed it out at the debates that we've been engaged in. His system is really inherently defective. That you would think that Adam's an anarchist, but he's not an anarchist. He wants to abolish the federal government. That's part of his plan. Well, he also, part of that is going to abolish, obviously, the Constitution. He doesn't believe in constitutions. Well, then what he wants to do is he wants 50 sovereign state governments. Well, and he calls this decentralization. It's not decentralization. Decentralization is when you have a federal government that's engaged in, let's say, education. And then you say, okay, let's divest the federal government of education and send it to the state and local governments. That's decentralization. Or criminal justice, get out of the drug war, but let the states handle the drug war. That's decentralization. What he calls for is 50 sovereign nation states with no constitution. So now we're talking about omnipotent governments, totalitarian governments. Take, for example, my state of Virginia. They're getting very close they're getting very close to seizing our assault rifles here. They're going to make it a felony. That's what they're talking about. And they're within an inch of doing that. Under his system, okay, so there is one possibility, though, that we could go to court, federal court, under the Second Amendment and the 14th Amendment, and declare this unconstitutional. And this is not beyond the realm of possibility. In the Heller decision, there was a gun control law in D.C., which is treated as a state, that went into federal court, and the Supreme Court ended up declaring it unconstitutional. So Adam sometimes says, well, do you trust the federal government with your freedom? Well, nobody trusts the federal government with freedom. But the judicial branch is a way to declare things unconstitutional. They don't act perfectly, obviously, but in this case, in the Heller decision, they did. So under Adam's plan, the state of Virginia would have total power to not only seize my guns, but also to re-implement segregation. Because remember, it was the Supreme Court that knocked out segregation. So that's why his plan is inherently defective, because it puts total, omnipotent, totalitarian powers in the hands of 50, which become federal governments. And that's the defect in this plan.
Okay. I've never heard it explained that way, but that's a good point. In Wall Surfer, I guess to piggyback when we mentioned like Rothbard and Hazlitt and Hayek, Wall Surfer asks any books or book that you would suggest as reading material.
Yeah. Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And anybody who reads that book, especially a college student, will know more economics than 95% of the college economics professors across the country.
That's how I learned economics.
It's the most fantastic introduction to economics. It's just, it blows you away when you read that book. Secondly, there's a great little book by Ludwig von Mises called Economic Policy. And this was a series of lectures that he gave in Argentina. I think it was in the 50s, but they're timeless essays. And so I would recommend that. Frederick Bastiat was a French free market legislator and libertarian, just heroic guy. And he wrote a little book called The Law, which is just fantastic, that talks about the legitimate role of government in a free society. And then I'd recommend anything Bastiat has written. I mean, there's nobody that writes better on the virtues of free trade than Frederick Bastiat. If you want to understand the concept of free trade, get Bastiat's books. I think there's 3 or 4 in addition to The Law. And anything by Mises. I mean, Mises is my fountainhead. I mean, he's just heroic because he's so uncompromising. If you want to learn, praxeology and the real life work on economics, I mean, Mises is great, but you got to start out in bits. And of course, there's Murray Rothbard, who was an acolyte of Mises, and I think Murray got his doctorate under Mises, if I'm not mistaken, at New York University.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. And I think so. Those are the major ones that I can think of. Atlas Shrugged. I mean, that's just a joy to read. I would highly recommend that for everyone. When I read Atlas Shrugged, my life was changed by Ayn Rand. So that's a good start right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've read most of those, and the nice thing is a lot of I think on like maybe the Mises website and maybe on like Lou Rockwell and some of these other ones, you can download the audiobooks of these for free a lot of times too. So you don't even have to like go out and buy a copy if you really don't want to.
Right. And you mentioned these websites, they're fantastic. I mean, they're a tremendous resource. The libertarian movement, okay, I'm running for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination, but the party is just part of a much wider movement. It's a dynamic, exciting movement. This is why people are coming into this movement in droves. And the think tanks and educational foundations are the foundation of this. You've got the Mises Institute, you've got the Cato Institute, Reason Magazine, Reason.com, the Foundation for Economic Education. That was the first libertarian educational foundation. I worked there for a couple of years. The Libertarian Institute, libertarianism.org, anniewar.com. Best website of all of them on foreign policy. LouRockwell.com. Tom Woods, he's putting out fantastic stuff. So yeah, it's an exciting movement. And you mentioned Rothbard. I didn't mention any books by Rothbard, but I mean, all the books by Rothbard are great. I mean, I love Man, Economy, and State. It's a little heavy reading for a beginner, but once you get steeped into it, it's a great book.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that he has essays on like how private courts could work and like all your questions can answer. And normally a lot of times if people ask me some question of like, well, how would this work or how would that work? I send them an essay from like Mises or Rothbard or somebody. I'm like, here, just read this.
Yeah, that's great because it's hard to get better than the masters,
So Robin Patty says, this isn't so much a question as a comment as when we were talking about healthcare, said, I had surgery a few years ago with a doc that didn't take any insurance, no billing staff, that was strictly cash. I spent 3 nights in the hospital plus 5 hours in the OR. All of it cost me $30,000. Wow. So that is a lot of money. I do know that there are some places nowadays, I want to say they're called like concierge care or something. And there's also like the Surgery Center of Oklahoma where all their prices are like listed and like that's it. And it creates competition. But also there are places where you pay sort of like a monthly membership fee almost like a gym, and then that center will cover all of your healthcare and all of your healthcare needs for that one monthly fee. And I think that that's actually a pretty cool system. My chiropractor does it, actually. He has something where if you buy a certain plan that you pay only once a year, then all of your visits after that are like half price, which I think is pretty cool.
It is, but it's still tinkering. I mean, in order to get rid of these exorbitant prices, you've got to, and I'm repeating myself, but you got to get rid of Medicare and Medicaid. Then prices start to plummet. And then you get rid of occupational licensure, which increases the supply of healthcare. You're not talking about $30,000 hospital bills anymore. You're talking about something very reasonable that people can afford. $1,000, $2,000 or whatever for these expensive things that are expensive in today's system.
Keith AV1 says, so the only way to implement a libertarian government is war. No way our government in the deep state relinquishes control without an overthrow of our government. Your thought on how it could be done?
Well, let's hope not, because war is a very nasty thing. And Jefferson, especially, including in a revolution. And Jefferson points this out in the Declaration of Independence, that people will put up with a lot of tyranny before they'll revolt, because revolt is very costly, because you're talking about a lot of violence, and you're talking about taking on the government's troops and its military and CIA and so forth. And that is not a route that we should even think about going. Like, ideas matter. They have consequences. They have power. And that's what I would like to use in this presidential race. They have the power, they have the money, they have their weapons, but we have something they don't have in this movement and in this party. We have principles, we have ideals, we have sound ideas on liberty, and I will take them over all the power and money in the world. And if you get lucky, and so you got to make your own luck sometimes, but that means acting with boldness. If we run a presidential candidate that's going to be running a Republican-like campaign, I have no doubts that we could get 3%, maybe 4% again, but who cares? I mean, this party's been in existence 49 years, and we're celebrating a 3% return, a 4% return. Well, if you run a presidential candidate that's just going to call for reform, Republican-like campaign, you don't have a chance for a big achievement. I say let's go into this thing with boldness, which means adhering strictly to libertarian principles. Fight them with our principles. These are our swords and our shields in this battle. Now you have a chance for a big payoff, because you're rolling the dice. You're taking a much bigger risk here, because, you're right. People are shocked. You want to abolish Social Security. You want to dismantle the national security state. You want a limited government republic. You're going to legalize all drugs. High risk here. We could drop back down to 1%. But with big risks come big rewards. And I think that's what we're shooting here, because you sometimes get lucky and you hit a period in history where people respond to ideals and principles without going to war. And that's how we get things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press and due process of law. It's because people are thinking at a higher level, and they say, let's go for these grand ideals without a war.
So on a side note, YouTube temporarily kicked me off, but I'm back on. So now we know what happens if I get kicked out of the stream. It continues, so that's good. So I missed part of your answer because of that. So I'm glad it didn't kick you out. So that's good.
I just hope it wasn't the government that took you out.
Well, it could have been. You never know. So Ranting Monkey is here, so that's pretty cool. And this question kind of piggybacks on that, so I'll put this one out now and then get back to the other ones. Ranting Monkey says, in my experience, libertarians seem unwilling to compromise. They'd rather have nothing than a half measure. Do you share that dogmatism? And if not, what would you compromise on?
Well, you can compromise on certain things in life. Like, if you want to go to a movie and your date or spouse says, well, I want to go see this other movie instead. All right, well, that's a compromise. You say, okay, I'll go see your movie. There's no compromise of principle there. But when it comes to principle, you can't compromise principles. Really, when you compromise a principle, you're abandoning it. That you have to adhere to your principles. So there would be no compromise of principles as far as I'm concerned. You stand for what's right. Now, people can take a look at it and they can say, Jacob, I've looked at your platform and your positions and I've studied it. I just don't agree with it. I can't vote for you. Okay, that's all right. Nobody's guaranteed success in life. That you lose a vote, you lose a vote. The worst thing that can happen is you compromise your principles in the attempt to get more votes, where you're becoming somebody you're not. You're saying, well, I'm going to become like a Democrat. I'm going to become like a Republican, and I'm going to adopt their essence, and boy, I'm going to please them. Well, then what happens? Suppose you get 50% of the votes. Who cares? You're not going to achieve freedom in office because you've already told people that you believe in what they do. So you at most become a reformer. You're not achieving freedom. So I say you've got to stand with who you are, your essence. We are libertarians. We are a radical philosophy. We need to embrace that radicalism. It's an asset. It's not a liability. And if people can't deal with it, that's their problem. But we shouldn't change ourselves, abandon who we are in the attempt to appease people. And from a practical standpoint, the last thing you want to do is alienate your base. I will always vote for the Libertarian candidate that's on there. I'll go down the polling place. I'll check mark Libertarian, even the ones that are running Republican-like campaigns. But they don't inspire me. You've got to keep your base energized. And the way you keep your base energized is by adhering to your principles. That's what excites your base. That's what you need, an excited base. And then hopefully that will expand. But I would not compromise principles one iota.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that Ranting Monkey brought up an interesting point. I mean, I know that personally, I would love to see a libertarian future, I guess we'll call it, but I doubt that I would see that really realized in my lifetime. But I certainly would be happy. Like, okay, well, if all we can do is get rid of the income tax, that's at least a step in the right direction. And then maybe we'll take another step and then another step and another step and hopefully get there eventually. But I think you're right. With me, it's like, okay, but my principles are still the same. And I'm not saying, well, like, oh, okay, let's go do this thing. It's like, well, okay, well, let's try to get rid of the income tax. And then once we get that, well, let's try to get rid of this next thing. And that's my view on it. At least
it's a fantastic view. I only have one issue with it, though, but it's a fantastic view because, as you point out, as a practical matter, you can't get rid of everything at once anyway. You can't push a button and say it's all gone. But your notion that you're not going to see liberty in your lifetime, I want to challenge that with everything that exists, because I'm still thinking that I may see the free society in my lifetime. And when I was your age, I was told the same thing. Oh, Jacob, we can't achieve freedom in the short term here, but in the long term, we can do it. Well, we're now in that long term. And so when I hear libertarians saying, well, Jacob, we can phase out Social Security over the next 40 years, it's like, why do I care about what happens 40 years from now? Like Walter Williams says, what have future generations ever done for me? Well, you in your age group, you're in our long term. Was when I was your age and I discovered libertarianism in my late 20s. We can achieve freedom. And I think there's a lot of people out there that are questioning. Look how many people who don't vote. I mean, those are encouraging things for me because they know it's a crooked, corrupt system. And there's a lot of sectors in society that know this is a crooked, corrupt system. I don't sell the idea of achieving freedom in the short term because I think it is possible.
Well, if you can prove me wrong, I will be very happy.
I hope so. I'm going to come back on your show and say, see, I told you so.
Jesse Meeks says, corruption in government is all but inevitable as it exists now. I personally believe in term limits for all elected positions. How do you feel about total term limits?
Well, I favor them, but I don't get excited about it because they're really just a reform. They get new people in, but they don't get to the root of the problem. That you'd have less corruption maybe because people can't, fortify their alliances and who they can trust and so forth. But here's the solution to the corruption in government. That if you have this libertarian society where no income tax and the no mandatory welfare, if you deny the power of government to do good things for people and bad things to people, like with tax regulations or building regulations and so forth, now nobody has an incentive to go down and vote anyway, because who do you care is in office when he can't do these things, bad things to you and good things for you or for anybody else? There's no more incentive there to put lobbyists and tons of money into political campaigns. The only reason there is so much interest in the presidential race is because the power that the president has. Remove that power and it becomes irrelevant. So at that point, okay, so let's say there's 500 bureaucrats in Washington. They may be crooked and corrupt, but they don't have a lot of money. So like, who cares? And they don't have a lot of power. They can't do all these good things and bad things to people. So who cares? That's the secret to ending the corruption in government. Take away their money, take away their power.
Lafiva, going back to when we talked about money, says metal always has value. Humans use tools. And I want to get a few more of these super chats in. Wow, it's already 8:30. People in the chat are telling me to go to Dungeons and Dragons. So typically I end right now and run off to Dungeons and Dragons in a hurry. But because of the lockdown, we don't have it tonight. So thanks, government, for ruining my Friday night.
It's all in your best interest, Nikki. The government's taking care of you.
Robert Chappelle says, and I think he had said somewhere, and I might have missed it, that you're a breath of fresh air. But Robert Chappelle says, what are your thoughts on the idea that practical libertarianism is a matter of trying to hold America in the center?
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think the practicality of libertarianism is that it is the solution to all the crises that Democrats and Republicans have forced it upon our land with their statist programs. I've been in the party off and on for a long time. I served 3 terms on the platform committee in the 90s. And the attitude there, and I think the attitude still is, that there is this dichotomy in the party between the purists and the pragmatists. And I don't see any dichotomy at all, because pure libertarianism really is the solution to the immigration crisis, to the healthcare crisis, the education crisis, the monetary crisis. So to me, that's the practical side of libertarianism. It's really the only solution to these crises. So I don't think it's a matter of moving people to the center or whatever. It's going to people saying, if you want to get rid of your healthcare crisis, here it is. You don't want to accept that, fine, but don't be lamenting and saying, "Oh, Jacob, look what a horrible mess it is." We're telling you why it's a mess. Come with us. And if you don't want to, well, okay, accept the consequences for your actions.
Mm-hmm. Now people in the chat are telling me that I should live stream D&D next time. I already asked my friends that, and they were not on board with that. But John Stiles asks, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this one, but he asks, what are your thoughts on gay marriage, polygamy, and brothels?
Get government out of all of them. Government has no business in marriage. Just leave that for the private sector. And brothels, I mean, government has no business making this illegal or controlling or regulating. They just leave it to the free market. I mean, I always found it quite interesting that a guy can take a woman out to dinner and plow her with all kinds of money and jewelry and food and clothing, and in return he gets some sexual favors, and that's all okay under the law. But if he instead says, here's a sum of money instead of all the other stuff, that all of a sudden he goes to jail for that. It's never made any sense to me. And I would say just leave. It's like how we start out the show. Leave people free to live their lives the way they want, so long as their conduct is peaceful and non-fraudulent. People make choices that other people don't agree with. Some people don't send their kids to church, and that upsets other people. Some people raise their children in ways that people don't like, or some people ingest substances that other people don't approve of. Okay, just stay out of people's lives, or at least keep the government out of people's lives. If you want to intervene because somebody's an alcoholic or a drug addict, that's fine. on a private basis, but you exhort them to go to Alcoholics Anonymous or something, but keep the government out of these areas.
I agree. Robert Chappelle says, how do we focus on down ticket? Everything truly important seems to be local.
Oh, interesting question. I think that the way you do that, I mean, obviously the people that are at the state LPs and the local LPs, I mean, that's a fascinating phenomenon, is that there's now county libertarian parties. It's really a testament to how this party has grown. They are building up the structure, the foundation of the party, and some of them are not enthusiastic about the presidential race. But like it or not, the presidential race every 4 years sets the tone. And this is what people are paying attention to. So they're going to be listening to a Libertarian Party presidential candidate. They're, making the case, going on CNN or C-SPAN or whatever, and people are that's the party spokesman. Well, if you have an exciting campaign, both an exciting ticket, both president and vice president, that has the potential of having a coattail effect for the down ticket people, without even going out and endorsing them or standing next to them and so forth. That people say they get excited about the Libertarian Party presidential ticket, then they might have a tendency to go in that ballot box and say, I'm going to vote for Libertarians all the way down the line. And an example of this excitement was when I was in the 5th grade. I got involved in the John Kennedy campaign and Lyndon Johnson, and my dad was active in politics. So I was going to campaign headquarters every night, stuffing envelopes, and I can't tell you the level of excitement there was for John Kennedy. And my dad took me to the Johnson Ranch. I met Lyndon Johnson, and there was just this excitement. Well, I think on a more limited scale, obviously, the same thing can happen in the libertarian movement, that you get this excitement going, and that generates support for the people running in the lower offices.
Mm-hmm. I know that on my end, I actually was asked to speak at the State Libertarian Convention for Massachusetts a couple of years ago, and I went and I talked about how to energize more like young people and the more local level and things like that, and it actually ended with me getting in a heated argument with some of the local heads of party, and I never got asked back ever again.
This is shocking.
So that's my claim to fame now. I didn't quite get kicked out, but I was shushed several times.
Shocking. Conflict in the Libertarian Party.
Right? Gardner Goldsmith is in, and he says, for all you both do, thank you. Love you both. Thanks for the positivity and promoting learning and liberty. Thanks, Gardner.
Yeah,
I feel like every Friday my thing is, I promise I'll respond to your email. The Revolution Report. That's who I was talking about earlier. It says, thanks for the plug. It's the Revolution Report, and we stream live with Jacob every Tuesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. Jacob, can you talk about Michael Holmes and your overall thoughts on the drug war?
Yeah, these guys are doing the Revolution Report. I mean, I cannot tell you how grateful I am for them. They're my social media team. They do my Facebook and the Twitter, and they've just been fantastic. And so they put together this live stream show every Tuesday night. One is Ask Me Anything, and that's every other Tuesday. And then the alternative Tuesdays, we deal with special issues. And so this week, we're going to be talking about the national security state this coming Tuesday. So what was the second part of your question?
Let me scroll back up and find it. Can you talk about Michael Holmes and your overall thoughts on the drug war?
Yeah, well, I was running a real active campaign in North Carolina. And part of this, and this was part of the primary system, the Libertarian Party was in the primary system there. And I announced early on, I want to win this primary. Even though it's not a binding primary, I wanted to campaign among North Carolinians and win this primary. And I announced that to all my opponents in the LP. Well, I ended up winning the primary, which was very gratifying. But as part of this, I focused a lot on the drug war, which is the most, in my opinion, the most crooked, corrupt, deadly, destructive, and racially bigoted war in our nation's history. I call it what Michelle Alexander, the noted African-American academician, calls it, the new Jim Crow. So I walked into a African-American newspaper in Raleigh and introduced myself and told them where I stood on the drug war. And I handed him my campaign card that called the drug war the most racially bigoted government program since segregation. And the woman behind the desk, who was black, she says, "Stop right there, Mr. Hornberger." And she calls over two reporters and she says, "Tell them what you just said." And I repeated it. Well, it turns out that one of the reporters had written an article that was coming out the very next day. I mean, talk about serendipity, on a man named Michael Holmes, who was a black man. When he grew up in a drug family, as all he learned, his parents pushed drugs. They had a major nationwide drug operation. So when he's 23, he gets busted by the narcs and he gets convicted of conspiracy to distribute cocaine, distribution of cocaine, possession of cocaine, multiple counts. And the judge slabs him with a 200-year jail sentence.
Oh my God.
I mean, it was just vicious, totally vicious. He did what's called stacking the sentences instead of running them concurrently all at the same time. Now, I was a lawyer before I got into this work, and the highest sentence I ever saw on the border, which was a major hub for drug importation, was 15 years. That was in the federal system. And the judges, a guy would get convicted on multiple counts, but the judges would run the sentences concurrently. They always felt 15 years was more than enough. One judge was called Maximum John. He was a federal judge from San Antonio. Always gave 15 years, 15 years. And that was considered an enormously high sentence. This guy gets 200 years. He's 23 years old. So today he's now around 50 or so, and he's still in jail. Nonviolent drug offense. And he's not the only one. I mean, this is what they've done with so many blacks. The penitentiaries are filled with blacks on nonviolent drug offenses. Well, so the reporter, a guy named Greg Frey, was writing this article because he was friends with this guy in high school, and he was trying to help him out. So, all the light bulbs went off in my head immediately. And so I saw this as a poster child for what I was saying. So I had flyers printed up saying "Free Michael Holmes," and then my campaign down there. And so we went into Wilmington, North Carolina, in the black neighborhoods, several of my supporters and I, and we just passed out these "Free Michael Holmes" flyers along with campaign brochures. And you would not believe the support we got. I mean, everybody in that community understood exactly what's going on in the drug war, that it's a racially bigoted system. You go into white elite America, middle-class America, they have no concept of this. Black America knows what's going on. So the reporter asked me if I would write a letter to the governor asking for a pardon, and I did. He then asked me to send a letter to the district attorney, who ironically and oddly under North Carolina law has the authority apparently to go to the judge and say, "I want to get this guy released." And so I wrote a letter to that district attorney. I put these letters on my website this week on my blog section at jacobforliberty.com so people can look at them. And I was going to organize a forum where the reporter and I, Greg Frey and I, were going to be the speakers. We were going to invite other speakers to talk about the drug war, because I've done these forums at historically black colleges and universities, and they've been tremendously successful. I mean, blacks know what's going on. Well, the last word I got from the reporter was that Michael Holmes has a lawyer team, a legal team now helping him out. And they asked us to back off because they got some things working. And so things are looking really positive. It looks like maybe there's a chance to get this guy out of jail, and he deserves to be out of jail. He's been there 25 or so years. I mean,
Wow.
horrible.
Well, I mean, and it's crazy to hear that sentence because, on the other side of things, one of the jobs that I've worked in the mental health field is at one point I was a therapist for the local criminologic population. So men and women on probation and parole. And I mean, at one point I had a fellow who was a sex offender who had offended against children and only got 2 years. And then you have this guy with drug charges with a 200-year sentence. Like, that's insane.
It really is.
I think they should be reversed, if anything.
Of course.
Gee
And
whiz.
your example is a good one, but there's murderers and rapists that get lesser sentences than 200 years.
Wow. That's crazy. Trashman4444 says, by no D&D tonight, do you really mean hidden, undercover, illicit D&D under the government's nose? I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. I am willing to bring supplies and say I'm delivering supplies. As of right now, there is no curfew or travel ban yet. There's rumors that could happen, but so far there's nothing. The National Guard has been mobilized here as of last night, supposedly only to help with testing. I'll believe that, sure. But so far, no travel bans or curfews here yet.
Okay, well, wait a minute now. For the uninitiated like me, what are Dungeons and Dragons?
Okay, so it's so nerdy. It's a role-playing game with dice, and you have like a dungeon master or game master, and he sort of like narrates the story and your characters. You create a character that sort of like moves through the universe and makes choices and battles things. And I currently play a 6'2" shape-shifting Russian guy, basically.
So this is all online.
No, it's in person. I mean, we can probably do it through a video call if we really wanted to, but that takes the fun out.
Where do you go?
I have a friend. We all meet at my friend's house. That's about like half an hour from here.
Do you dress up for the part?
No, I go straight from the live stream usually, so I look like this.
Oh, okay.
But and actually our DM's friend is in the chat asking me about the curfew, so that's why I wanted to clear that up. John Stiles says, as a Christian conservative, I agree about 80 to 85% with your libertarian views, but are your thoughts of God in your equation?
Well, we have to work on that other 10 or 15% here. Yes, they are in my equation. I'm a devout Christian, and I believe that everything about libertarianism is entirely consistent with Christianity. In fact, I believe that the system that we have is opposite to Christian principles. I mean, God says, "Thou shalt not steal." Well, what is it when you're taking money from one group of people to whom it belongs and you're forcibly giving it to another group of people? I mean, if I do that, if I accost you at an ATM and take your money and go give it to the poor or somebody needs an operation, I'm a thief. And yet, the government does it. No, they're so good, caring, and compassion. God gives us free will. Okay, well, the government says, well, God made a mistake. He should never have trusted those young people with free will because they won't help out in a pinch. So we're going to force them to help out. We're going to correct God's mistake. So when you look at these essential tenets of Christianity, libertarianism is the only philosophy that's consistent with them, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Robert Chappelle says, draft Penn Jillette for Nevada Assembly. And let me get the last few in here. Jesse Meek just saying, gotta go, doll. Help teach a low light firearms course tonight. I'll catch the rest tomorrow. Okay.
Wow, teaching a course. That's interesting.
That is pretty cool. Stephen Lundgren asks, what about immigration and border security?
Eliminate it all. There's a reason why you have an immigration crisis, and that's because you have a socialist system. It's based on central planning. You've got the government allocating or determining how many immigrants, allocating to each country what the number of immigrants are going to be, what the qualifications, credentials. This is what's called central planning. It's what Mises said produces planned chaos. And that's what we have. We have this like huge backup of people at the border that want to work. And over here, you got farmers that are seeing their crops rotting out in the fields because they don't have enough workers. This is a classic socialism. And then in order to enforce this system, they brought into existence a police state. And I've seen this police state. I grew up on the border. I grew up on a farm that was on the Rio Grande. We hired illegal immigrants. They're the hardest working people I've ever seen. But you've got, if people have never gone to the American Southwest, they don't know what a police state is. They have highway checkpoints for highways running east-west, for people that have never entered Mexico. They have full authority to search at these places. You have to show your papers. If you're dark-skinned and you're driving an old car, you're in trouble if you don't have your papers with you. They have roving border patrols that just stop people arbitrarily. I was victimized by one of those in high school. The guy just pulls me over and says, open your trunk. No probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, nothing. They have trespasses onto farms and ranches without warrants. They would come to our farm, and if we put a lock on our gate, they would shoot it off, and they would just come in and start looking for people that we were hiring. It was horrible. And so there's only one system that works, and that's freedom and free markets, which means open borders. And that's our heritage. Open immigration is our heritage as Americans. There's nothing else that's going to work other than open borders. That means get rid of ICE, get rid of the immigration service, the free market, people crossing borders peacefully the same way they do domestically. People cross the Maryland-Virginia border every day. That's what we need to be thinking in terms of on international borders.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I certainly think, when I was I feel like I'm telling all of these when I did this thing in therapy stories today, but I've had a lot of different jobs within this field, surprisingly. But one of the things that happens when you first start in this field is you are given your clinicals, really your 2 years before you're able to be fully licensed and independent. A lot of times they have you do in-home therapy because it sucks and no one else wants to do it. And, that was in all of the ghettos and the poor areas around here and stuff. And I ended up having a lot of people who were immigrants. And I would always say to them, as a conversation piece, okay, well, what made you decide to come to the US? And without a doubt, 9 times out of 10, they would say, well, the US gives you free money, or the US gives you free healthcare if you're an immigrant. And I think that if we eliminated the welfare state, then immigration would definitely not be as much of an issue. I mean, it would just be, people traveling freely rather than people traveling, trying to get a handout, whatever. And I remember that was a big wake-up call for me when I was getting those answers from people, because that I had expected them to say, work or family or something, not free stuff. Maybe I was a lot more naive back then.
Well, my experience is the complete opposite. I mean, all the immigrants I've met, they want to get rich, and you don't get rich on welfare. And they're always raiding private businesses. They're never raiding welfare offices. But my position, Nikki, is that, look, we stand for certain principles. And if those principles are costly in terms of higher taxes, we can't abandon those principles just because it means higher taxes. If it means that $5,000 a year you pay extra, or whatever, $1,000 a year, I say that's a price that has to be paid for standing for your principles. An example is this: the drug war. Most libertarians, I think the drug war is a litmus test, whether you're a libertarian or not. And I think every libertarian, genuine libertarian, favors drug legalization. Well, let's assume that if you legalize drugs, there's a lot of these drug addicts that are going to get treatment with Medicaid, and that's going to increase taxes. Should we as libertarians say, well, look, we need to support the drug war until Medicaid's abolished? I don't think so. I think we keep standing on principle and focusing on getting rid of the welfare state, but we don't abandon our principles in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Right. Someone in the chat has asked about your stance on women's reproductive rights.
Okay, I got to go now. Okay, I'm a Catholic, and so I believe that life begins at conception, and so I'm pro-life. But at the same token, I really do not put a lot of faith in the ability of the state to solve the large amount of abortions in society. I think you make it illegal in one state. I don't think the federal government plays any role in this, but one state makes it a criminal offense. People go to another state, or women resort to the coat hanger or whatever. I really think the ultimate answer is an educational one, where you're raising people's consciousness that, hey, there's another alternative here. I think there's counseling groups that counsel women on going to birth. And I think also the dynamism of an economy makes a big difference here too. That when you have a dynamic growing economy where people are saving money and they have a large nest egg, I think it makes it easier to bring a child into existence as compared to if you're impoverished and you have nothing and you think there's no way I can do this. So I think ultimately I don't put a lot of faith in the criminal justice field to accomplish what pro-lifers would like to accomplish, and that's reduce the number of abortions.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Very good point. So it looks like, oh my goodness, it's already almost 9 o'clock. So, it looks like we ran out of the super chats.
We tired them out. We exhausted them.
We did. So, is there any other things that you want to say that you don't think that we got to? Do you want to share your links, all of that fun stuff?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to get a sense of the kind of work I've done over the years, they can go to the Future of Freedom Foundation's website, fff.org. And I again emphasize they're not endorsing my campaign. And then my campaign site is jacobforliberty.com. If people like what they're hearing, hope they'll donate. We're short on money here, and we need some resources. And what this campaign is about, Nikki, is about liberty. I mean, that's why I jumped into this race, is that I want to be free. And I really do believe that freedom is possible, but that it can only be accomplished by adhering to principle. And that's the kind of campaign I want to run. And that's the kind of campaign that I want LP members to know, that you make me your nominee, and you can rest assured that this will be a campaign based purely on libertarian principles, with the objective of getting people to think about them, with the aim of garnering a critical mass of people that will bring us the free society for which we all yearn. I mean, that's our goal as libertarians, is freedom. That's been the goal of the Libertarian Party since it was formed 49 years ago in David Nolan's living room. We want to be free. And that means making the case for freedom, which means adhering to our principles.
All right.
And let me say thank you very much for having me on. Thank you for your guests. I mean, your viewers there, for the great questions. An honor and a privilege. Really important.
So Q says, great stream. Thanks, Jacob. We had a bunch of people realize they weren't libertarian and jumped ship throughout the stream. That is true. I noticed that too.
Oh, well.
And the philosopher is here. Hi. She says, I want freedom and I want it now. I'm tired of being taxed and coerced to death.
Music to my ears.
All right, folks. So if you liked Jacob and what he has to say, his link is down in the description. I believe it's jacobforliberty.com. So that's down there. You can go check out. Actually, I have to say, out of all the other candidates, you're the only one that seems to have a full website with all of the issues on it. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of folks that don't have anything about their platform anywhere on their website. So I appreciate that yours is on your website. And there's all kinds of great resources and stuff on there for everyone that wants to check it out. So as I said earlier tonight, provided that there is no lockdown and I can get my internet to work, even if there is, I mean, we're already in a lockdown, basically, but provided that I'm allowed to leave my house next week, I'll be doing a stream, and hopefully I'll be able to have decent internet for that. So, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Jacob, thanks for coming on and sticking around for this long.
Oh, you're
that is
welcome.
awesome. I mean, we tired out the super chats and the people in the chat, and even scared some people away.
Yeah, we wore them out.
All right, so everyone else, thanks for your donations and your questions. And don't forget to check out the partners in the description. USCCA has a special offer going for the rest of March. Because of National Women's History Month, they are extending the $25,000 giveaway, so you can check that out. And also, I believe My Patriot Supply is still selling emergency kits. I heard rumors from some people that they might be on a 10-week shipping delay now, but they are still making kits and still shipping them out. And Jim Nugent is here and says, thanks to both of you. Good night and be safe. So on that note, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming and asking Jacob your questions. I'll see you on the next one. And as always, thank you for helping me to spread the message of liberty. Good night.